So we've looked at Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, a little bit through the video. We need to know about his ideas. His enormous fame rests on the scope and enduring power of those ideas. What the video does is to question some of the ways that his concepts have been received and sometimes treated in a kind of oversimplified way. So his book, The Wealth of Nations, set out to explain how and why countries like Britain and the Dutch Republic had experienced massive economic expansion and a widespread rise in the standard of living. So he created a set of terms and concepts that remain fundamental to how we talk about political economy today, supply and demand. His idea that those are working as an interaction of two halves of the equation to set prices, the invisible hand of the market, meaning that economies sort of self-regulate through the total process of exchange. Productivity, a key idea, we talk about gross domestic product, as well as efficiency, because he was thinking about how factories and the kind of different forms of trade were leading to specialization and how that was increasing efficiency. He also saw a relationship between markets and a republican system of government. In forming these concepts, Smith is reacting to a massive change in the historical structures. And Kendra is one of many students who really identified that as a key moment in the video, which is absolutely correct. The concept of capitalism being a product of historical processes rather than a naturally occurring phenomenon. We don't find it in all places and times. We only find it arising in a certain time period when the 1500s give way into the 1600s and 1700s, where the old major institutions of European life, religion and aristocracy, were being challenged by the wealthy business class, commercial success, and that was changing the class structure. Remember, class is partly about economic wealth, how much money you have, but it's also about status. Guys like this, the guys in Rembrandt's portraits, the business money, was beginning to challenge the authority, the money, and the status of the church, the popes, and of the dukes. The dukes, the princes, the kings, the queens, all were considered the lords of the land in the older system of political economy, right? So if we go back to the 1200s through the 1400s, say, the time, let's chunk that period of time. Throughout Europe, wealth was land. People who owned and controlled that wealth inherited that land because they were the aristocrats, those who were said to have noble ancestry, to be superior to the common people, to have higher status. The common people were lowly laborers. So you see here these two wonderful paintings that were made in the 1400s, and they belong to a book that was made for this guy, the Duke of Berry. And here he is in his court with everyone fawning over him and paying homage to him, giving him gifts. There are his knights in their elaborate get-ups. And over here you have one of the serfs who work his land to increase his wealth. The guy in the patched, torn clothing bent over the plow to work the land, and there are people, shearing the sheep and doing other tasks because their labor is going to be turned into profit for him. They will turn over what they produce. So in this system, the peasants, the serfs, were in bondage to the lord of the land, to the duke. They were quite often unable to leave the land. There was essentially no social mobility. Many of these working people in Europe lived in a degree of servitude that was really a form of slavery. And here we have cathedral builders, and you can see that even these skilled craftspeople are toiling in arduous jobs without profiting from their work. Look at the bent neck here. The artist is making sure to tell us how backbreaking this labor is. That rigid social structure had started to change a little bit in a few unusual locations. So for instance, Siena, the city of Siena, painted here in this fresco, and Florence were cities that did something remarkable. They established what were called city communes. Their commune was that they, as the city dwellers, communally would own their city independently from the dukes who had previously controlled the larger land. They were able to wrest control of their city from the aristocrats. They established a city council, so they were small city-state republics. They were ruled by oligarchs, the wealthy few, so they were not democracies in any form. But still, we get here, this is the 1300s, the idea of a representative government that owes its allegiance to the public good, not to the aristocrats who own the land. And in these cities, certain cities in Italy, certain cities in today's Belgium and the Netherlands, the merchant class gained independence from the aristocrats. So here's that historical process that is slowly evolving and changing to allow the development of capitalism. And their growing wealth meant that they could exert their political will to shape civic life. So here we have a prosperous merchant, an artist, who's also a goldsmith, works lots of precious materials. You can tell the aristocrats are his clientele. And they look quite snooty, and they literally look down on him. But look at the pride in his face. He is beginning to be a little bit of his own man, to feel that he himself, as the owner of his shop, has command over his tiny little territory of his trade. And then, as we've seen with Rembrandt painting the anatomy lesson here, we get new forms of knowledge and authority in science and engineering. They are leading to new forms of prosperity, but also to new political claims. Because what's happening is these successful middle-class people, the burghers, the bourgeoisie, the business people, the professionals, we could call them, they challenge the aristocracy who have inherited wealth through inherited land, castles, who have inherited title that says they are superior. These new professionals are going to challenge that status system. And so this great historian, Eric Hobsbawm, who we'll be reading later in the semester, he has this marvelous quote: "The gods and kings of the past were powerless before the businessmen and steam engines of the present." The Industrial Revolution is going to overturn that system of inherited title and wealth. It's amazing that we have the wheel of the steam engine depicted here, and a revolution is, of course, a wheel that overturns the status system. So roads and railway tracks will be part of the wealth of nations in the 19th century, just as broadband internet and vaccines are today. Because one of the points that Smith was saying was that wealth is not just the actual money in the treasury. Wealth is the productivity of the nation and the means of producing. So that if you have trains and broadband internet, you can now produce more, you can do more. You actually are allowing for the growth of innovation and the growth of productivity. As these new merchants start to make their mark on the world and to claim political ascendancy, one of the questions that comes up, it's ripples throughout Smith's work, it's in the video, is about the morality of this new capitalist system. So it's interesting to look at this Hogarth painting because it actually depicts this social tension between old money aristocrats. There he is pointing to his family tree that goes back to the knights, the lord of the land, all the way back in the 1200s or earlier, versus the merchant who's got the money bags and he wants that status. So he's essentially selling off his daughter, who's going to be doomed to marry this rather skeletal and I don't know, oddball looking fellow who is a kind of aristocrat that we're supposed to understand has been pampered and spoiled and has become a kind of moral disaster. She's going to marry him, and this is going to be the new political economy of Britain. So there's another view here where Greuze is also showing a marriage. This is not an arranged marriage. This is a marriage of affection, which was quite a new thing in the 1700s. Women had been essentially owned and passed between father and son-in-law for exchange of financial interests. And this was slowly beginning to change. Their arms intertwined suggest that there's real affection here. There is an exchange of money. The dowry is being passed on. Marriage was still very much about monetary exchange. But this painting is saying, well, in this world of the village middle class, the country people, the wholesome country people, the marriage is first and foremost about affection and family relationships. We could call it a painting that's about family values in this age of changing economies and social realities. So if we compare Copley's portrait of American revolutionaries with the swing, our Rococo frou-frou, we can see that there were claims being made about which class the merchants, the commercial classes, or the old aristocrats deserve to rule because of their moral virtues. Here we see the Americans are asserting that they're projecting industriousness. She's working the silk, modesty, and a pragmatic mindset. So as these American capitalists are staking their claim to self-rule, they are separating themselves from the culture of the aristocrats with their luxurious frivolity. Smith saw the growth of markets as a major factor catalyzing the expansion of political and social freedoms. He wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776 as the American Revolution was underway. He was well aware that the economic self-interest of the Americans was driving their rejection of British rule, their move towards self-rule. The video confronts how the question of slavery is not adequately addressed by Smith. Now, Smith himself did not own slaves. He abhorred slavery. He condemned it as evil. And he did write about how slavery would be eliminated. He argued that slavery was inefficient because a slave cannot develop their own skills and talents. They're not motivated to work because they don't profit from their efforts. He thought it would be rooted out as a backward economic system. But he really did not confront the fact that the brutal transatlantic slave trade was woven together with the growth of capitalism. The people of African descent, as depicted in this ceramic relief sculpture, were subjugated under a system of chattel slavery that was inhuman in its cruelty. And that is not something that fits into Smith's idea that industrial capitalism is bringing material wealth as an engine of progress, which is leading to the growth of widespread political freedoms. We see when we look at the video that that isn't entirely true. It's somewhat true, but it's not completely true. And the broader issue of exploited labor is not going away. It's the major hole in Smith's thinking, because he doesn't acknowledge how much capitalism wants to be able to exploit labor in order to maximize profits. He doesn't recognize that the brutal oppression of serfs and laborers in Russia, here in this painting and across Europe, was in no way alleviated by the growth of the free market. And this is a photograph of a child laborer in an American cotton mill circa 1912 by the great photographer Lewis Hine. It testifies to the fact that industrial production and the wealth it brings to the nation often comes at the expense of the exploited, the vulnerable, and the desperate. That is what Smith could not or did not answer, and it is the question that would lead to the writing of Karl Marx in the 1840s. And of course, it is a question that is still being fought over in the politics of today and the economic struggles of today.